Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. I'm your host, or it's actually the afternoon here. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Kiana Canada. Welcome to the Kiana Canada Show. I'm getting a little glare, so I'm going to try and let's see. Can I? Just a moment. I'm going to change things a bit. Hold on. Okay, I think we're good now. And I'm going to check one last thing to make sure the thumbnail is showing appropriately. I know I should have all this completed, but the thumbnail is not showing appropriately, but let's see what we can do, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go. How are you out there? Like, how has your weekend been? I know, like, it's very warm here. It's how I like it. I'm like so thankful for the weather. We haven't seen like this kind of weather in a long time. And so it's a breath of fresh air. Let's see if it's. And if not, I'll just have to change the thumbnail later. So I'll just change it later. Okay, let's see. Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll change the thumbnail later, and we'll deal with that later. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into today's topic, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that your likes and your shares, what it does is it pushes videos like this up in the algorithm. It tells the algorithm that videos like this are important. But we must remember that just because videos like this are not pushed up in the algorithm, that is not an indication that videos like this are not important. And there is an announcement that I often give on transnational repression. But, ladies and gentlemen, since I'm going to be talking about transnational repression in this video, this is going to actually structure the video. I'm not going to be giving that announcement because, of course, this video is going to be about transnational repression. So if you haven't already, go ahead and get yourself a cocktail, a cafe, hot chocolate, bottled water, energy drink, whatever you drink, and come right back. And I'm going to just drink a little bit of water, and we're going to get started. So, ladies and gentlemen, I uploaded a video yesterday and I briefly touched upon acts of persecution and what I believe to be the United States harking back to a period in time where Black Americans were not permitted to speak out against the dominant society in a time. So, a time in life which was very hurtful for Black Americans. where Black Americans did not have any rights. And so we understand that this was, for starters, it was during the slavery era. So this was during the period where it was the transatlantic slave trade, where enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas to work without any pay. And of course, we know what would happen if they declined to engage in labor. Some So, I mean, if we look at in history, yeah, of course, they were chastised, but then they were lynched or whipped, or even in some of the most extreme cases for women, they were essayed. And so, ladies and gentlemen, uh, that takes us to the Jim Crow period, where, of course, there was liberation from slavery, and but there were still Black codes in place that uh, stopped Black Americans from having the same rights as the people in the dominant societies. So, of course, during the Jim Crow era, Black Americans were forced to drink from separate water fountains, sit at the back of the bus, attend separate universities, attend separate schools, etc. And this was the period after, so during this time, and then there was Reconstruction. During the Reconstruction period, ladies and gentlemen, um, this was a period where Black Americans attempted to build themselves up and to build their communities up, and those communities were torn down by members in the dominant society, including law enforcement and vigilante groups such as and hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. And so, ladies and gentlemen, after these errors of persecution and oppression, what did we have after that? So we had mass incarceration that we're still dealing with in police brutality. And it brings us to the question as to whether Black Americans are susceptible to persecution or oppression, because in discussions that I've been having lately with many people, there seems to be this idea that Black Americans can't be persecuted, or Black Americans are somehow immune from persecution or oppression. And additionally, that Black Americans are essentially immune from transnational repression. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I think when we look at when we're like examining this and what it's for what it's worth, I think we come to understand that Black Americans can be persecuted and oppressed just like any other group. We're not immune from persecution. We're not immune from transnational repression. We are susceptible to transnational repression. Now, because we're talking about transnational repression in this video, what is it, right? What is transnational repression? What does the literature say about transnational repression? Well, ladies and gentlemen, essentially transnational repression is a kind of cross-border intimidation that happens to asylum seekers, refugees, journalists, human rights defenders, academics. The list goes on. Essentially, it's a type of intimidation, and sometimes it can be lethal. Lethal intimidation for a person who is speaking out against some kind of human rights violation. Now, there is confusion about who can perpetrate transnational repression. Sometimes people think that an ordinary person can perpetrate transnational repression, but in order to perpetrate transnational repression, you have to have institutions backing you up. It's kind of like the idea of about racism, right? So we know the simple definition of racism is where a person dislikes someone because of their skin color or their ethnicity, right? But the sociological definition of racism has to do with prejudice plus power. So, in order to practice racism, you have to have one, prejudice plus power. And the prejudice is, of course, this dislike for this particular group, and the power has to do with institutions. Being able to have institutions to back that prejudicial feelings, um, to be able to condone and give imprimatur to those prejudicial feelings. And essentially, when we really read the literature on transnational repression, as what I've been doing for like the last um, year or so, and possibly even longer, because I was reading before I learned about transnational repression. I was reading on coercive repatriation, and I remember there was like an article that I read, um, or I think it was like a chapter in a book that I read, that it was talking about coercive repatriation, but it didn't necessarily say that it was transnational repression. It was just saying that repatriation can be coercive. And so I think that was in 2023, when I read about that. And so for approximately 2 years, I've been really enmeshed in studying transnational repression and the typology of what it includes, who it includes. And so just like the sociological definition of racism, the same thing with transnational repression. In order to perpetrate and uh, perpetuate transnational repression, in order to put this into circulation, you have to have institutions and groups to back you up to say that that is okay. And so, can and to be clear, so an individual person, one person can't uh, put into practice transnational repression, because again, if a person is acting, uh, attempting to silence someone's opinion, they're possibly doing it on the behalf or on the instruction of government officials. And this brings me to a point where okay, before I go there, I want to say that breaking transnational repression, of course, the way that I think Dana Moss, she coined the term transnational repression. She is a scholar who studied, I believe, in Scotland, and she is very knowledgeable about this. And there are many other scholars too that have contributed to the literature on transnational repression. But essentially, the transnational repression framework is, I think, broken down into uh, maybe two parts. And so the top part is, if we're looking at it as a dual process, some states will put into circulation hard tactics, which include incommunicado detention, enforced disappearances, extraordinary renditions, and uh, lethal threats and lethal retribution and unalivement. And these are, when you look at the literature, this is often countries that we see that the names that are coming up that I'm reading is, um, I'm seeing the name Russia, I'm seeing the name China, I'm seeing the name Egypt, I'm seeing the name, excuse me, I'm seeing the state China, I'm seeing the state Russia, I'm seeing the state Egypt, I'm seeing these states, I'm seeing the state Turkey. These are the states that I'm seeing that are engaging in the hard tactics. But there are soft tactics as well, ladies and gentlemen. And these tactics are easier for democracies to put into circulation. Now, we must be clear that the literature on transnational repression, it makes clear that not only do um, authoritarian regimes partake in transnational repression, but also democratic regimes as well. And there is chapters that I've read in Dana Moss's book, her new book. In that book, it talks about how in certain countries, such as, for example, well, within in South America, and I can't really remember exactly what country it was in South America. I'm trying to think. I want to say it's either Chile. No, that's where all of the excuse me. That's where all of the dissidents actually fled to. But I think it was a number of countries, so like Argentina, Colombia, etc. These were countries where there were activists and human rights defenders speaking out against political repression and human rights violations. And the United States actually was helping uh, put into circulation this political repression. These individuals, these activists, journalists, human rights defenders, what they did was they fled to Chile for protection. And I think that they were protected there. But this demonstrates that not only do countries such as authoritarian regimes practice transnational repression, but also democratic regimes as well, as we have seen with that example where the United States has helped countries in South America intimidate and persecute activists and journalists. And this brings us to today's topic, ladies and gentlemen. Are Black people susceptible to transnational repression? There's been some conversations that I've been having with people, and they don't seem to believe that a Black person can experience transnational repression while they're abroad. Their theory is that Black Americans are not speaking out against anything important enough to be persecuted or to be put through transnational repression. And so when I was having a conversation with a person about transnational repression, that person's perception was, well, why would the government come after you as, and not anyone else? Why would they choose you and not anyone else? And I want you to think about that for a moment. Why would they choose me and not anyone else in this jurisdiction? Well, for starters, ladies and gentlemen, is because when I speak out against a human rights violation, I do so very candidly. And it's like, I forget the saying. What is it? Straight, no chaser is the saying that they use. I think it's like that, right? I give it to you straight, no chaser, and I speak very candidly about it. Now, I've sat in multiple groups where we are talking about persecution, we're talking about Supreme Court rulings, we're talking about human rights violations, and oftentimes, ladies and gentlemen, when I'm in these groups, what is happening is that these groups tend to put all of the pressure on Donald Trump. Now, as you know, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I'm not a Republican. I am progressive. But one thing that I do know is that I can perceive when there are groups of people that are attempting to put all the blame on one particular person and not take responsibility for what's happening in their own backyard. And so in these groups where we would talk about oppression and we would talk about political persecution, they would attempt to say, well, what's happening in Trump's America? And I was like, well, wait, let's talk about what's happening here, because there's human rights violations happening here. Like, you, yes, what's happening in the United States is horrible. I'm an American citizen and I see this happening and I speak out against it, but we need to talk about what's happening here as well. Like, we can't close our eyes to what is happening in the jurisdiction that we live in. And so I bring that up because oftentimes when you speak candidly like that, you become a pariah, right? Because you're going against the grain of what everybody is doing or what everybody is saying. And so you may say, well, Kiana, well, how does this relate to the topic that you're talking about Black Americans being susceptible to transnational repression? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am a Black American. I have lived abroad in Europe, and I have been undergoing transnational repression for quite some time. And no one has spoken out on my behalf. No one has advocated on my behalf. And when I attempt to explain that this is transnational repression, they attempt to try and give it another name. So for them, because it is a country in the global north that is using these tactics, they don't want to call it transnational repression. They're in denial about it. And we're going to go into why that could be, right? Just a moment. Get my notes. So I think one of the reasons why that is because for Black Americans, we're unreadable. So what does unreadable mean? So that means that we are perceived as untrustworthy and non-creditable. But this, of course, is a form of testimonial injustice. This is an unjust deficit of credibility by people who possess negative stereotypes. So, for example, the fact that you're saying that I'm unreadable and that my story is not indicative of a story, or that my experience is not consistent with other experiences of persons who could be persecuted, you're attempting to erase my experience as a Black person who has been persecuted abroad. So, for example, in that conversation that I was having with that person, I was like, okay, so there were university students in the United States who were arrested by ICE. And why were they arrested? Well, there were allegations that were made against those university students that they were in support of organizations that were a threat to national security. And not only that, ladies and gentlemen, but they were speaking out against the international conflict in Palestine and Israel, and I guess being very tied to that conflict because of their nationality. And so in my particular situation, I am very connected to the experiences of Black Americans because I'm a Black American. And when I see extrajudicial executions happening every day in the United States and Black people being the victims of that, to me, this looks like ethnic cleansing. And so it's something that I have to speak out against. But for people that I speak to, about this, and I said, well, because I'm speaking out against the harm that is happening to Black Americans in the United States, they can't understand how this is a form of transnational repression when the government is attempting to stop me from speaking out about that while I'm abroad. And so they say, well, you can't possibly be going through this. Like, you're not Palestinian. It's only Palestinians that could be persecuted. It's only Palestinians that could be going through transnational repression. You don't look like a Palestinian to me. And so we'll have to just sit with that and ask ourselves, like, are Palestinians the only people that could be persecuted and by their government? I mean, what's different here, I think we would agree, is that I'm speaking out against something that's happening in my country by my country, something that my country is doing to my people. They're speaking out about something that another country is doing to their people. What's the difference there? The difference is that in their circumstance, they have at least 50% of the American people backing them, and about 75% of people on college campuses supporting them as well. With me here in Belfast, 0%. I mean, I have a lot of people who signed a petition. That's important. But in terms of like organizations, and in terms of human rights organizations and lawyers, I don't have that. No lawyer is next to me. No lawyer is saying that what I'm going through is a problem. And so we need to sit with that, and we need to ask ourselves, well, why is that? Well, there are stereotypes about Black Americans that often come up in the literature and often come up in books, which lead to Black Americans being isolated. And one is that we're less, so there's this stereotype that Black Americans are less intelligent, which has been invoked to, I think, to intimate that we cannot recall or describe events accurately when in reality that we can. And to reiterate, there is this stereotype that Black Americans are not trustworthy and that we're not honest, which has obvious implications for any kind of, for example, for a risk assessment or for a court proceeding or for in a hearing, anything, right? So it could be administrative, it could be criminal, it could be civil, it could be just quasi judicial. But as you can see, it has implications because in many of these proceedings, credibility is very important. And then there is this stereotype that Black Americans, that we're all violent. And this allegation is bolstered by its consistency with the stereotype. But I think what is important to understand is that when Black Americans, if they do decide to flee the nation and they do decide to claim international protection in another country, well, they're doing so because they're against all odds, right? So they're up against the odds, and they don't see how that they can. I don't think that there's like an avenue of redress, and so Black Americans will make an attempt to file an asylum claim to be protected in a different nation. And going back to that discussion that I was having with that person, they were saying, well, why I don't believe that this is happening to you. Like, you can't possibly be going through transnational repression. You're not Palestinian. And I I said, well, does the literature on transnational repression, like, does it say that only Palestinians can go through transnational repression? Because when I'm reading the literature, which I mean, I plan to do my dissertation on if, of course, everything goes well, I'm not seeing anything in the literature where it is differentiating between nationalities and saying only one nationality can be put through such a practice. I'm not seeing anything like that. Quite the contrary, it specifically talks about marginalized groups, groups that have a history of marginalization and groups that have been disenfranchised. These are groups that are more susceptible to transnational repression. And so during that discussion, they were like, "Well, where is the evidence?" And so I showed uh, this person the evidence, and they were like, still resistant. And I was like, "Okay, so right now you're knowledge resistant, right? So it doesn't matter how much evidence that I show you. That and of course this wasn't. This was just like in a discussion that I was having, in the lobby somewhere with a person. And I was like, okay, so you're knowledge resistant. You like no matter how much evidence um, that I show you, that's not going to ever be good enough for you because again, you already have set in your mind who you believe to be right in this particular situation. So you're in denial that a transnational repression is happening within this jurisdiction. And they got a little bit angry and they were like, don't say that I'm in denial. Well, I was like, well, you are because I'm trying to show you that this is what is happening to me, that I know that I've been experiencing it for quite some time. I'm reading the literature on it. I'm actually studying it. I've been reading the literature on it for approximately 2 years, but you haven't read the literature on it, and and you're telling me that you don't believe that I'm going through transnational repression. And so when I ask you, like, okay, what is your understanding of transnational repression? And you can't articulate that, then it makes me feel as if like you have a vendetta, or okay, I won't say you have a vendetta, but you have a fixed belief about who you believe can be persecuted and who you believe cannot be. And so this goes to like evidence, right? Because we often say, well, where's the evidence? And ladies and gentlemen, I've uploaded so many videos about the burden of proof and evidence, but it seems like we have to continue to go through this. So who has the burden of proof? Like when we're talking about a person being put through transnational repression, where does the burden of proof lie? Well, initially, it lies on the person bringing forth the claim. So that would be me. I am the person who is being put through transnational repression. And so I have to make out a prima facie case that this is happening. And that's just essentially me putting forth enough facts that this is possible. After I've done that, the burden of proof shifts to the government to disprove that would happen. So, for example, it is often the case that claimants have limited access to information needed to substantiate their claims. In a substantial subset of such cases, the party on the other side of the case has access to information that they would help clarify the situation. The party on the other side is often the government. The party with access to and they would be loath to disclose it in such and so essentially they're not going to want to disclose it should it go out against them. and would have no reason at all to do so should they be the beneficiary of such information coming to light. And so, ladies and gentlemen, there are a couple of cases that support this position that the government is reluctant to actually release this information that they have put a person through transnational repression or they put a person through some type of political repression. And I'll attach that case in the description of this video. For instance, there's another case, ladies and gentlemen, in Bergersen, the European Court of Human Rights held where matters of public concern are raised, there is no general requirement to show that there is a sufficient evidential basis. So, for example, oftentimes transnational repression is a matter of public concern, ladies and gentlemen, because it not only affects the person that is being put through transnational repression, but it often affects people around us. So, for example, if I am put through transnational repression and the government unalives me because of that, well, that gives precedent to this kind of practice and allows the government to do it to other people. And so it is a matter of public concern. But if we go back to like the burden of proof, which is often what is raised by people that are putting into practice transnational repression, ladies and gentlemen, we need to remember that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has more or less recognized this point, having observed that given the difficulty for those who are the object of discrimination to prove racial prejudice, the court agrees with the European Court of Human Rights that the burden of proof falls on the state, which controls the means to clarify incidents that took place on its territory. So, ladies and gentlemen, I will attach a case that is speaking about that as well. So, again, oftentimes we are told by we are being told by people that don't have a law background, or even those who do have a law background, that are attempting to, uh, I guess, manipulate case law and to skew the opinions of the court. And their idea is that, okay, well, you're being put through this practice or you're being persecuted by the government. Well, you have to come and you have to bring forth a case. Not only do you have to bring all the evidence, but you have to prove right then and there that it is the government. You have to actually bring a person. You have to habeas corpus, bring forth the body, right? And that's not the case, ladies and gentlemen. When the evidence is in the custody of the government, when the government has evidence that actually would prove or disprove this practice, the burden of proof really falls on the government and not the victim. And if you want to read more about transnational repression, there is just an introductory chapter. Now, I've read several chapters of Dana Moss's and Saipira Furstenberg's book, Transnational Repression. But if you, I guess, if you don't have enough time to read the entire book or to take chapters and like read chapters that are like very pertinent, I would really recommend that you read the introductory chapter, which is Transnational Repression as a Growing Global Threat. Now, that chapter is going to tell you a lot about what transnational repression is, who partakes in it, so for example, it talks about the Arab Spring, and it talks about how democracies have engaged in transnational repression, but there is a lacuna in the research as it relates to researchers actually looking into countries in the global north. But what Moss and Furstenberg found was that the authors, what they stated was that often states use covert forms of transnational repression, which includes hacking and spyware. And this is within their, I believe, their introductory chapter, Transnational Repression as a as a growing global threat. So I would really recommend that you read that chapter on transnational repression. That introductory chapter is really packed with information that would actually help you to understand this practice. Let's see. Is there anything else that I want to talk about? Let's see. Yeah. So again, there's different cultures, of course, and some cultures they have the opinion that only certain groups can be put through transnational repression, right? And in their opinion, they feel that Black Americans are excluded from this group of people. But and it raises the question, well, why is this? And I think we could look to Castillo and Mallard, and what they found is that when a communicator and observer are from different cultures, that the observers will apply social norms concerning nonverbal behavior that may differ from the communicator's own norms. As a result of this discrepancy, a communicator who is behaving consistently with her cultural norms might violate the so essentially what they're saying is, um, as a Black American, I can act one particular way. And I can be, well, so basically what I'm doing is I'm applying this to transnational repression. So as a Black American, I can be acting a particular way and complaining that I'm going through transnational repression, but people are going to see that differently if they're from a different culture. Different cultures view different cultures differently. And so they might not believe that I'm going through transnational repression because I am from a different culture, because there are certain cultures that are uh, more susceptible, I guess, or more prone to being put through transnational repression, or that's what we've been told. That is what we have been conditioned to believe, that only specific groups can be put through transnational repression and not others. And so I bring that up because, again, as a communicator, I'm communicating to people that I trust and that I am attempting to confide in about my experiences. And they are observing me and they're saying, okay, well, could this person be put through transnational repression? Well, she's from the United States of America. She's an American citizen, and we don't know any American citizens who have gone through transnational repression. And so she is from a global north country. We're living in a global north country. So in their personal opinion, they believe that it's highly unlikely for a person like me to be put through transnational repression. So, what do we take away from this discussion? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what we take away from this discussion on transnational repression is that it is possible for any person to go through transnational repression, but we must remember that transnational repression requires institutions to back it up, to say that those behaviors are okay. A person can be put through transnational repression unless institutions are on board with it. And so when we think about that, we need to ask ourselves, like, are we doing enough to stop this practice? Are we doing enough to stop these behaviors? Are we doing enough to hold states accountable for their persecution and for uh, their state crimes? Essentially, that's what it is. Are we doing enough to hold them responsible for state crimes? And I would say that we must do everything that we can, ladies and gentlemen, to uphold international human rights law and uphold human rights law, uphold the rights of citizens, the rights of asylum seekers, the rights of refugees. It is our duty to uphold these rights. Now, again, it's going to be a very difficult process, but we can do it. And if we stick together, we can do it. Now, states are going to attempt, and intelligence agencies, not only states, intelligence agencies, and these corporations that are being paid by these states, they're going to do everything that they can to try and rip us apart. And it's up to you. It's up to you as to whether or not you want to feed into that narrative that they are putting out into the universe. That's really up to you. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Remember that this is just a discussion on transnational repression. Sometimes when I'm having these discussions, I'm trying to word it in a way where it doesn't sound like too academic and collegiate because I'm having conversations with everyday people, and I know that like this needs to be like these conversations have to transfer to ordinary people so that they understand like exactly what transnational repression is. So like sometimes I'm going, okay, how can I say this in a way where it like translates to ordinary people but still keep it professional and where it resonates with those people who are in the field of academia. So um, I need to find a good balance on how to do that. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.